Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
Good evening, everyone. And good evening to those of you who are joining us on Zoom. Welcome. My name is Charles Stang, and on behalf of the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard Divinity School, I'm delighted to welcome you to the annual Dana McLean Greeley Lecture for Peace and Social Justice. Before I begin, however, I'd like to read out the university's acknowledgement of land and people. Harvard University is located on the traditional ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and we honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. So welcome to the CSWR. The Greeley Lecture Endowment Fund was established to support an annual lecture at Harvard Divinity School to focus on issues of peace, social justice, and interreligious dialogue, with the aim of reaching a broad audience across the Harvard community and beyond. And to that end, I'm delighted to hear that we have, I think, 125 people joining us by Zoom. Since its founding, this annual lecture has brought to campus a remarkable range of scholars and public intellectuals. Recent Greeley lecturers have included Cornell Brooks, Anthea Butler, and Biko Mandela Gray. It's truly an honor to welcome tonight's speaker, Professor Blair Stonechild, a member of the Muscowpetung Saulteaux Nation in Saskatchewan and a professor of Indigenous Studies at the First Nations University of Canada. Professor Stonechild's life and work embody the difficult truths and the enduring possibilities at the heart of reconciliation, education, and cultural survival. He is a residential school survivor, having attended the Qu'Appelle Indian Residential School from kindergarten through grade 9, an experience he has described as involving indoctrination and spiritual abuse. And yet he pursued his commitment to learning with extraordinary resolve, earning degrees from McGill University and the University of Regina. In 1976, Professor Stonechild became the first faculty member hired at the First Nations University of Canada, founded that same year. Over the decades, he's served not only as a professor, but in senior leadership roles, including the Dean of Academics and the Executive Director of Development. Beyond the university, he has contributed to the public understanding of Indigenous histories and cultures through service as a trustee of the Canadian Museum of Civilization. And most recently, he was recognized with the King Charles III Coronation Medal, a testament to a lifetime devoted to education, scholarship, and community. Professor Stonechild's scholarship spans Indigenous history, policy, post-secondary education, and, perhaps most germane for this evening, Indigenous spirituality. And his publications reflect this wide-ranging and deeply integrated intellectual project. His major works include Loyal Till Death, Indians and the Northwest Rebellion, The New Buffalo, The Struggle for Aboriginal Post-secondary Education, and Buffy Sainte-Marie, It's My Way. And especially relevant for tonight, he has a trilogy on Indigenous spirituality. In 2016, he released The Knowledge Seeker, Embracing Indigenous Spirituality. In 2020, Loss of Indigenous Eden and the Fall of Spirituality. And just in 2024, Challenge to Civilization, Indigenous Wisdom, and the Future. We had hoped to have all three of those books available for purchase, but unfortunately, we have only the one, Loss of Indigenous Eden and the Fall of Spirituality, but the others are very easily available through all the usual online booksellers. So across these works, Professor Stonechild asks an urgent set of questions. What happens to a people and to a world when spirituality is attacked, suppressed, or stolen? What's lost when education is severed from community, from a community's elders, and from the land? And what might become possible if Indigenous wisdom traditions are taken seriously, not as artifacts of the past, but as living intellectual and spiritual resources for the future, for our future? In The Knowledge Seeker, Professor Stonechild draws on guidance from Indigenous elders, more than a dozen, to show how the notion of spirit is not an add-on to Indigenous life, but a cornerstone of Indigenous knowledge systems and cultural continuity. In The Loss of Indigenous Eden, he follows this inquiry further and deeper, responding in part to contemporary questions about whether spirituality still matters, placing these questions in historical context and tracing what colonialism sought to dismantle, namely a way of living in reciprocal relationship with the rest of creation, including our human kin and our more than human kin. One of Professor Stonechild's most concise statements of this vision is also one of his most memorable. He writes, "If you ever hope to understand Indigenous spirituality, you have to understand that we are spiritual beings on a physical journey." That line alone opens an entire worldview, one in which education is not only about information, but about forming right relationships, relationships with one another, with the land, and with the more than human world. Professor Stonechild describes Indigenous spirituality as life in a quote-unquote enchanted world, where spirits lurk in every corner, in trees, in animals, and even in rocks. And he draws on teachings such as those of the Lakota medicine man Fool's Crow, who speaks about communicating with one such rock. Quote, "I talk to it like a person, and I let the rock talk back to me. Doing this expands the way I behave towards rocks and towards other things, and my mind grows." In other words, attention becomes ethics. How we learn to perceive the world shapes how we learn to treat it. He also invites audiences to take seriously Indigenous accounts of human origins that depart radically from dominant Western narratives. As Saulteaux elder Danny Musqua puts it, quote, "Our people are beings who come to earth from the stars to be men. Our people are beings who came to earth from the stars to be men." In this telling, the universe is dreamed into existence by the Creator in response to a question from the spirits about what it's like to be physical, an account that underscores a central claim of Professor Stonechild's work, that spirit is the essence of creation, and that everything created carries spirit. Tonight, Professor Stonechild will deliver a lecture entitled Reconciling the Loss of Indigenous Eden, where he will discuss his research on the concept of Indigenous Eden, its loss, and how the process of truth and reconciliation might offer solutions for the future. In a moment, I will ask you to join me in welcoming Professor Stonechild. But before we erupt into applause, I want to acknowledge two guests we have with us this evening. Jim Peters, Jr., the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Commission on Indian Affairs. Thank you for joining us, Jim. And Anita Mother Bear Peters, who is a respected Mashpee Wampanoag clan mother, educator, and master artisan who's based in Massachusetts. Now, we have for you, Professor Stonechild, a gift of tobacco, and my understanding is that Anita, you do as well. So I'm going to first give this patch, this patch of tobacco on behalf of the Center for the Study of World Religions. Thank you so much for joining us. And Anita, would you like to do the same?
On behalf of my tribe, Mashpee Wampanoag, I want to give you this pouch of tobacco. I hope your time here is peaceful, your journey home is safe.
Thank you very much.
Luckily, I made two gifts for you.
Oh.
But being matriarchal people, we never give a married man a gift without giving his wife one. So this water bottle carrier is for Sylvia.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. That's more important.
Please join me in welcoming
And I also have a small gift for you as well. I'd like to give you my trilogy on Indigenous Spirituality. Good. So thank you very much, Professor Stang, for that generous introduction. And I'm very happy to receive the tobacco. It's something which is very important to our people, you know, the maintenance of spiritual protocols, because that really was what sort of kept our spirituality alive and kind of forced us into, you know, thinking in our highest spiritual potential. And I'm very glad to be with everyone here this evening, including all of the people who are here online. So I bring you greetings from the Cree and Saulteaux peoples of Saskatchewan, and in particular from the First Nations University of Canada. That's a picture of our university in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada. And it's a beautiful building which has been designed by Indigenous architect Douglas Cardinal. And some of you may be familiar with that name through the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. And he was actually involved in that Washington project at the same time he was constructing our facility. And I was privileged to actually be part of what he called the Visioning Committee, which met in Washington, D.C. at the time. This is a photo of the interior, the main atrium of the building. And you will see to the left a teepee structure. That's actually called the ceremonial teepee. And that's where our ceremonies are held. And so it's considered to be the heart of our institution. I must also acknowledge my elder mentor from Saskatchewan. His name is Danny Musqua. His last name, Musqua, means bear. And it's actually in his honor that I wear this shirt tonight. Lastly, this is a picture of Danny and I when he was teaching in one of my classes. Lastly, but leastly, and not leastly, I should say, I must acknowledge my wonderful wife, Sylvia, who has spent many hours transcribing interviews and reacting to my manuscripts. And so I owe her a great deal of gratitude. So I still remember at age 6 when I was dropped off at the Qu'Appelle Indian Residential School. It was a huge 4-story red brick building with high fences around the yard. My suspicion was right. It was essentially a reformatory school where we were forcibly confined and our routine was tightly controlled. I was assigned the number 81, far down the pecking order of kids in the playroom. Our supervisor was aloof, but he was very effective with the strap. We were viewed as undisciplined savages who had to be brought to true religion. So we were fed copious doses of prayers, Bible studies, and confessions. We prayed at every occasion, bedtime, meals, classes, and events. By the end of the day, we must have prayed almost a dozen times. I spent 9 years in that institution. But we did have some leisure time on weekends. A big treat was watching television. In the late 1950s, the most exciting ones were the cowboy and Indian shows. A covered wagon or a stagecoach would be rumbling down a dusty trail when all of a sudden someone would shout, "Indians!" A bunch of menacing figures would then appear on the crest of a hill. Galloping down, soon the fight was on. Bullets and arrows were flying everywhere. I'm embarrassed to admit, when we played, we preferred the roles of the cowboys. See, they lived longer. That school left a huge impression on me. We were told how fortunate we were to have civilized education. But we were never taught anything about our own history or culture. During that time, I recall I was wondering, what was this whole experience really about? I had a nagging feeling that there was a lot we were not being told about. By the time we were finished school, we felt a deep sense of disconnection and worthlessness. But I loved learning. The residential school was being closed down, so I completed my high school at a Jesuit-run school in Regina, Saskatchewan. I later learned that I had been sent there because they had hopes that I might one day become a priest. After that, I managed to get to McGill University in Montreal, where I obtained a degree in political science. I recall that when I wrote papers about Indigenous treaties, professors were the ones asking me the questions. Then, through fortunate timing, after convocation, I was hired as the first professor at the First Nations University of Saskatchewan in 1976. What I can say is that despite all of those years in institutional learning, I found that my most valuable lessons would come from Indigenous elders. After decades of learning from them, they encouraged me to use my academic training to share their teachings in books. This resulted in my trilogy on Indigenous Spirituality, which I will refer to later. So what is Indigenous Eden? In this talk, I will focus on the Indigenous spiritual beliefs and teachings I received that led me to the concept of Indigenous Eden. Finally, I will make some comments about what I believe happened and the implications for our contemporary world. Elders encouraged me to better explain the fundamentals of our beliefs and practices to Indigenous peoples, especially those in urban centers who have lost connection to their culture, as well as to the non-Indigenous. There are several Indigenous nations in Saskatchewan, and while the beliefs of each specific group should not be overlooked, in my 6 decades of working with Indigenous scholars from across Canada and the world, including Latin America, Oceania, Europe, India, and China, I can confidently state that there is a common ideological foundation among all of them. One of the first elders I encountered when I started teaching at First Nations University was Ernest Tatusis. Here's a picture of him, would have been taken about the 1970s. Now, Ernest would go around telling anybody who would listen, he would say, you know, we Indigenous people lived in the Garden of Eden, and we never abused the gifts of the Creator. He was referring to our sacred beliefs about our responsibility of stewardship towards creation. And this concept inspired the title of my book, Loss of Indigenous Eden and the Fall of Spirituality. To me, Eden means a place where there are harmonious relationships between humans, the flora and fauna, and with the spirit realm. In my book, I describe this as being the lifestyle of Indigenous peoples from around the globe, from the beginning of modern human existence 200,000 years ago to the emergence of civilization. My mentor, Danny Musqua, told me that we are originally spirit beings who asked the Creator for permission to experience physical life. In fact, he said, the name of our people, the Anishinaabe, and Saulteaux, of course, are Plains Anishinaabe, means those who came from the stars to become humans. He described how we selected these human bodies, choosing them as our vehicles for earthly experience. The purpose of this journey, he explained, was to learn about and how to develop proper relationships. This experience would not be easy, and an important initial task we faced was to learn how to control these new vehicles. Elders tell me that the Creator Manitou had clear expectations of us. We refer to them as the original instructions. In return for the privilege of experiencing the gift of life and creation, humans are expected to be grateful, to respect all created things, and to act as stewards of the natural world. We call this principle Wakotouin, the idea that we are all spiritually connected. We are not only connected to other humans, but also to animals, plants, birds, insects, fish, and even stones. My name, Stonechild, for example, indicates being related to the spirit of the stone and signifies being under its protection. And you may have heard similar names, for example, such as Sunchild or Thunderchild or Buffalo Child. But of these relationships, the most important is to the spirit realm, which includes our ancestors, guardian spirits of the natural world, and the Creator. With these original instructions, we built our human societies. We were also given other tools to help us live properly. These center around the concept of mi'uwichetwin, which is the law of harmonious relationships. Our main directives are the 7 grandfather teachings, often referred to as the 7 values. These are courage, humility, honesty, generosity, love, respect, and wisdom. And these actually form the basis of our legal system. Like any laws, deviation from these strictures would be met with sanctions. The offender could be ridiculed or ostracized, or in the worst cases, banished or put to death. We had several spiritual disciplines to help us remain on the good path. These include fasting, praying, sharing, parenting, learning, teaching, and meditation. These disciplines are emphasized in our ceremonies. There was a ceremony for every important stage and event in one's life. These examples include the naming ceremony for a newborn, vision quest for adolescence, the sweat lodge for purification, the pipe ceremony for inclusion, learning lodge with elders, the spirit lodge for inquiries, and the thirst or sundance at spring equinox for renewal. Ceremonies were held continuously to remind us who we are as spirit beings and of our responsibilities. They also played vital roles in healing. Elders add that the more religions stray from the original instructions, the less they resemble spirituality. In the education of our children, the focus was not on reading, writing, and arithmetic. Sacred stories were taught to children to educate them about their place in creation and to emphasize the development of spiritual values and responsibilities. The stories sometimes seemed like silly fairy tales, but they had a very important function of inspiring awe and respect towards the natural world. Their education was focused on proper behavior and on having humility and love towards life, not the 3 R's, which are designed to empower people to manipulate and control nature. Adults who became most advanced in ceremonies could receive spiritual gifts, such as extraordinary abilities to heal. In the area of politics, our elders say that the highest form of politics is spirituality. Leaders are obliged to have 4 days of ceremony in which they're reminded about our purpose on earth, the necessity to create harmony before they went into negotiation. What might the world be like if heads of nations today had to collectively undergo spiritual protocols, such as fasting, cleansing, and praying before heading into the United Nations Assembly? Territorial borders were also underpinned by protocol. For example, instead of a passport, when one entered another's territory, the first step was to engage in a pipe ceremony. By doing this, they affirmed that the visitors shared common values and attitudes and would exhibit accepted behaviors. This then granted them automatic access to hospitality and the bounty of the land. Maybe that's a suggestion for a new American immigration policy. Indigenous economic policy was simple: to trust that the gifts of the Creator would provide all that was necessary. There was an obligation to share the commons with others, regardless of their status, provided that proper protocol was respected. Abundance was guaranteed through resource policy. Again, it was very simple. Just allow nature to flourish. The result was evident in the fish scooped out of the ocean by basketfuls, passenger pigeons that darkened the sky and apparently were very edible, and 60 million bison that carpeted the horizon when Europeans arrived. In the Amazon, indigenous peoples incorporated practices that allowed the jungle to flourish more than it otherwise could. Such policies sustained hundreds of millions of indigenous inhabitants in the Western Hemisphere. This is a map that I kind of drew when I was working on the book, Loss of Indigenous Eden. And it was my attempt to kind of show what Indigenous Eden might look like. And this is in 1491. So basically, if you take a look at the area in green, that, in my interpretation at the time in 1491, would have been what I would call Indigenous Eden. The part in pink would be the part that I would call civilization, and I can talk about that more. And essentially that would have been reflected in essentially the influence of the Abrahamic religions at the time. And so this map is not totally accurate, because there are, for example, there's areas in northern UK and Europe that were still totally indigenous and stuff like that. So, but it was an attempt to kind of portray it, and there's a version of that in my book, Loss of Indigenous Eden. So in Africa, 200 years ago, there were at least 27 million elephants, 3 million giraffes, 1 million rhinos, and 1 million lions. Today, only 2% or less of those diminishing species remain. In my understanding, such natural abundance existed across the globe. Whether you're talking about the Celts of Europe, or the Tengrists of the Middle East, the Dalits of India, or the Taoists of China, or a multitude of indigenous groups in countries such as Indonesia. Now, Indigenous Eden was even a place of miracles. Eminent American Indian scholar Vine Deloria wrote a final book which was called The World We Used to Live In. In it, he documents eyewitness accounts by non-Indigenous observers of extraordinary phenomenon. These include influencing the weather, rapidly growing plants, locating lost persons or objects at a distance, incredible healing of wounds, and even raising the dead. Were these possible in a world where people believed that spirits lived in everything, could be communicated with, and would intercede when needed? Now, the indigenous world was not perfect. As humans, we had weaknesses, and we did commit transgressions. But there was one evil entity that we feared the most. Its name was Witigo, the spirit of greed. It was believed that Witigo would divide, distract, and ultimately destroy people. If infected, an individual had to be dealt with immediately, lest that evil spread. If all efforts to heal failed, then that individual would be exiled or face death. Whenever there was an individual or group difficulty, quick recourse to ceremony was necessary in order to restore harmony. Indigenous Eden's fruit was socially and environmentally healthy societies. It created an upward momentum of cycles of growth, abundance, and foundation of social health for future generations. It created societies that could persist indefinitely. And the system functioned well because everyone recognized one ultimate authority, the loving and benevolent Creator. Now I have come up with a term to describe the Indigenous way of thinking and behaving. I call it equalization, in order to contrast it with the way of living that we have today called civilization. Because essentially they're two entirely different ways of thinking. Now this may all sound romantic, but it was a real lifestyle that existed amongst Indigenous people worldwide for hundreds of thousands of years. It needs to be pointed out, lest we lose awareness, that Indigenous people remained the majority of world population up until the 1820s. That's only 200 years ago. Where I come from in Western Canada, for example, Indigenous people were still over 99% of the population at that time. So how was Indigenous Eden lost? My quest to understand the differences with non-Indigenous people led me to the library, and I dug up a pile of books on civilization, hoping to learn something. What I discovered was eye-opening. I found out that there's a unanimous theme about what civilization means. And what it is, it's marked by that point at which humanity decides to take control of nature. Examples include the development of agriculture and animal husbandry in Mesopotamia. Emerging civilizations, such as the Egyptians and the Greeks, etc., are marked by the accumulation, acquisition of wealth and power, large fortifications, standing armies. This resulted in my aha moment. Elders had drilled into me that the Creator allows humans to experience physical life, but that we are to respect and care for creation, not to place ourselves above it or to abuse it. Preservation of spiritual harmony was to be paramount. I concluded that the emergence of civilization was, in fact, a radical departure, and not a good one, from hundreds of thousands of years of Indigenous wisdom. As civilizations grew more powerful, they began to perceive Indigenous cultures as backward and inferior. They viewed Indigenous peoples as lazy, not effectively using, and therefore wasting their resources. Hence the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and successive European empire builders felt justified in making Indigenous peoples and their lands easy prey. Aristotle taught the theory of natural slavery of the inferior to his student, Alexander the Great, therefore condoning his empire-building conquests. The patriarch Abraham dismissed Indigenous nature worship as inferior to the new covenant in which mankind has a special relationship with God. Later, Julius Caesar would go around massacring millions of Indigenous Europeans on the pretext of bringing civilization to them. Then when the Americas were discovered, the Pope blithely granted permission to Christian nations to subdue and take sovereignty over these Indigenous continents, purportedly to save their souls. When the British came to the shores of Turtle Island, they originally wanted religious, political, and economic freedom. I came across an article on the Revolutionary War and noticed a quotation by Thomas Paine, one of the main proponents of independence. He said, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again," unquote. The same article states that young soldiers were comparing what they were doing to the exploits of Julius Caesar and saying that they were going to make world history. But what were they really doing? Would the new country be something that would be fundamentally different to what they had left in Europe? Or would it simply be reintroducing the same old system, well, with some new enhancements? This behavior of the newcomers was an anathema to our people who welcomed them, thinking that they shared our worldview. As Chief Powhatan asked the Jamestown colonists in 1609, quote, "Why do you take from us with force that which you could have through love?" Unquote. In essence, what was happening was the continuing wave of civilization, drowning out eons of indigenous equalizations. By the time diseases such as smallpox took their toll, there was little contest. This is just a graph or chart of the decline of indigenous populations. And again, I cobbled this together by consulting a number of demographic atlases. And for today, the definition I use is essentially the United Nations definition, which I agree with, which is based largely on cultural characteristics, the way that indigenous people live. But there are, obviously, in some cases, there are, like contested definitions of what is indigenous, which is a whole different story. But anyway. The 1820s was an important watershed period. It marked the beginning of non-indigenous people becoming the majority of world population. The then world population of 1.6 billion people was the last time that world population was in balance with the Earth's natural carrying capacity. The 1820s also featured the explosion of industrialization, technology, transportation, and, of course, the dispossession and colonization of indigenous lands across the globe. As science and technology progressed, philosophers such as Immanuel Kant positioned rationalism and the intellect as the highest expression of spirituality. René Descartes declared, "I think, therefore I am." The ideology of social Darwinism in the mid-1800s applied Darwin's theory of evolution to humanity. Where were indigenous peoples? They were placed right at the bottom of the evolutionary scale and were expected to disappear in the face of civilization and progress. A 1963 United Nations affiliated International Commission on the History of Mankind involved hundreds of scholars from around the world and produced a multi-volume report documenting civilization's development of agriculture, the arts, and the drive towards the use of technology. However, one of its central conclusions is interesting, and it was that humans are nothing more than evolved primates. By the way, I went to the Museum of Ethnology today, and they're saying exactly the same thing there. And as such, that we have inherited animals' natural tendencies of violence, greed, and unpredictability. Well, apart from being unfair to animals, that was news to us indigenous peoples. Because over tens of thousands of years, that's the first time we ever heard that story. Now today we see banks and money as essential and indispensable features of life. Did you know that banks emerged with colonization of indigenous peoples across the globe in order to facilitate rapid exploitation of their lands? Do you know where the word bank comes from? 16th century traders returning with spices or slaves needed money to finance their next voyage. So where did they look? Well, they looked to the nearby bank of the river, because lo and behold, there sat the moneylenders. So today, money is the lubricant of society and the crack cocaine of economic development and expansion. We can't live without it. But then why was it that indigenous peoples of the Americas didn't have any money systems, had no need for them, yet did fine? The rational mind, driven by curiosity, profit, or war, rather than spirituality, churns out a steady serving of frightful developments, such as artificial intelligence, robotics, cryptocurrency, rockets to Mars. Pristine landscapes are transformed seemingly overnight into cities of skyscrapers, stores, mansions, and streets. Is it improvement or is it abomination? It's civilization on steroids. Without spiritual guidance, the intellect is like a ship without a rudder, or worse, like a dangerous beast. When compared to the 200,000-year span of modern human existence, non-Indigenous people have been the majority for only the last 200 years. That is only 1/1000th of our time. With the apocalypse of the Indigenous world, we are relegated to a minuscule and marginalized portion of global population. So who will listen to our wisdom? Is reconciliation necessary? We were not mere hunters and gatherers, as is consistently portrayed in the disciplines. This reduces our culture to the level of simple and ineffective resource consumers. It totally ignores our underlying philosophy, laws, and policies that produced Indigenous Eden. Given Elder Tutus's claim that we lived in the Garden of Eden and did not abuse the gifts of the Creator, suggests to me that maybe there were human inhabitants of the Garden of Eden who lived before Adam and Eve, and that the latter only represent those first ones to embrace a human-centered worldview. To us, the land was not a wilderness, but rather a sacred home to be cherished. Our dream was not to be wealthy through the exploitation of nature's bounty, but rather to pursue our spiritual potential. But colonists, these new lands were nothing more than a windfall to be commodified. Right now, many are flush with prosperity. However, it will not last. Why do I know this? Because this economy is built on frail, artificial human institutions, not on the unfailing and everlasting resilience of nature. I fear that we are not learning from our global collective experience, and we are not adequately questioning the fruit of civilization itself. We only seem to be able to see a year ahead or to the next election cycle. Why are we not capable of planning ahead 100 years or even 1,000 years? That's the type of forward thinking that our ancestors employed when considering future generations. There has always been an ideological war waged against Indigenous cultures as not having anything desirable, and as being destined to inevitably trod down the path of civilization with its greed and violence. The inhabitants of Indigenous Eden practice great humility, self-restraint, and self-sacrifice in order to sustain nature and sustain social stability. Yet their lives were contentedly filled with song and dance, ceremonies, and natural abundance. By remaining loyal to the Creator, they avoided the agonies created by our destructive human-made institutions and technologies. I think it is widely recognized today that humanity faces serious, if not potentially fatal, challenges, such as nuclear conflict and climate change. When I search the internet about solutions, I often come across anarchy. Just let everything fall apart and then rebuild it. Or alternatively, rely on artificial intelligence to make critical decisions for us. Yet, never do I see the idea that Indigenous ways of thinking or being that have proven successful for over 99% of modern human existence can ever provide solutions. Now in Canada, Truth and Reconciliation started in 2008 with a federal apology for Indian Residential Schools policy. Interestingly, there's a reason why reconciliation has gained traction in Canada. It comes down to a document called the Royal Proclamation of 1763, in which the British Crown, in return for First Nations allegiance, guaranteed them treaty and land rights. This document was found and is recognized by the courts as being foundational document of Canada's Constitution. In other words, the courts have recognized and confirmed that Indigenous people are indeed full citizens and in addition possess special rights. Of course, the interesting is that the proclamation was created in response to the American Revolutionary Movement. And so for that, we have you folks in the United States to thank. So thank you. The resulting 94 calls to reconcile focus on a broad range of issues and are aimed primarily at grassroots level initiatives rather than at government. They have become a significant motivator for individuals, organizations, and bureaucracies to pursue specific goals and commit to them, whether that be in inclusion or in providing services. These enable Indigenous communities not only to survive, but to contribute, for example, with creation of First Nations University. My understanding is that in the United States Constitution, Indigenous tribes are deemed to be domestic dependent nations. Their well-being is heavily dependent on the goodwill of federal and often state governments. So Indigenous peoples do not have the equivalent legal, let alone political clout. I also understand that truth and reconciliation initiatives are rare, if not non-existent, at the federal level. Matters like slavery, for example, have not been addressed as such, and therefore leave unhealed wounds. At the same time, I recognize the challenges given the magnitude of American population and the geographic expanse. I'm going to conclude. So, we have the 7 generations prophecy, which foretold that strangers would arrive on our shores who did not share our ways and would damage the world. The prophecy concludes that if those new arrivals do not return to our original ways, then all humanity will perish. And while others have called Indigenous peoples the white man's burden, it now appears that the white man has become our burden. Questions I leave you with are, is the general public up to the challenge of recognizing and reconciling with Indigenous peoples? Can our education and economic systems be refashioned to respect and nurture rather than exploit and destroy the land? Can all of the tools and resources of government and society be brought to bear on such monumental tasks? I believe that such change is theoretically possible, but I'm under no illusions that it can happen quickly, without catastrophic upheaval, or even at all. But I believe we all need to find a way to work together under the guidance of the Creator to ensure that we can fulfill our greatest spiritual potential on this earth. So this is the series of 3 books that I've written on Indigenous spirituality. The middle one managed to make it here. And so these 3 books actually reflect the past, present, and future, my interpretation in a way, based on what the elders have told me, my interpretation of Indigenous spirituality. And so I hope that you will either pick up my book or order it on Amazon. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening.
CSWR.HDS.Harvard.edu. Copyright 2026. The President and Fellows of Harvard College.